I'm the director of the Canada Institute here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I'd like to welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the nation's memorial to the 28th President. The center is a forum for nonpartisan discussion on a variety of national and global issues. Within that context, the Canada Institute works to increase awareness and knowledge about Canada and U.S.-Canadian relations among U.S. policymakers and opinion leaders. The State Department released the final version of the Environmental Impact Statement to the public on August 26, 2011. The Environmental Impact Statement does not represent a decision on the pipeline, but its finding will factor into whether or not it is considered in the national interest. Today's program is the proposed Keystone XL Pipeline in the national interest, falls in State's 90-day national interest determination phase for the Keystone XL Pipeline. During late September and October, State will host a series of 9 public meetings around the United States to give individuals an opportunity to voice their opinion on the national interest question. There will be a meeting held here in the Ronald Reagan Building, not in the Wilson Center, but in the Reagan Building, on Friday, October 7th. So we have a tight program this morning, and I'm pleased to turn the microphone over to Mike Van Duzen, the Wilson Center's Executive Vice President, who will introduce our honored guests. Mike.
Thank you. Thank you, David, and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the official national memorial to the 28th President, a public-private institution. It's we try and do 2 things here. We accept 150 scholars from all over the world that do research and writing in this building. And secondly, we are a convener. We seek to provide safe political space for the discussion of key national issues. This is a very important issue. We've got 2 excellent panels put together, and I'm very happy to introduce the first speaker, Senator John Hoeven of North Dakota. He served with distinction as governor of his state for 10 years and came to the United States Senate a year ago, in January 2011. Governor, thank you for being here. We look forward to your remarks, and again, you are welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center anytime.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. It's great to be here. Appreciate it. Always enjoy coming. I've been here for a number of events and different types of events, so it's always interesting, and this is truly a wonderful facility, and you and your staff, everybody does a great job in running it, not only in terms of your work, but in terms of your hospitality, and always making myself or whoever it is feel welcome. I'm going to try to move just a little bit so I'm not in the spotlight. It feels a little, I don't know how it looks out there, but it's a little weird. There you go. Is that all right? All right, thank you. Well, good morning. It's good to see all of you, and I'm kind of the warm-up speaker for the main event. The main event's the panel, but it's just like when you go to a concert, you have that kind of warm-up band and then get you in the mood for the real thing. So I know it's early. I'll try not to be too snoozy, but they do have coffee out there and stuff, so if you're feeling a little drowsy, you can sneak out and get coffee. And if you want to get a little doze in before the panel, this is your chance. If you get back in the corner there, it's where the light isn't so good. You can pull snooze. It's a little easier, plus it's harder to see us. So it's great to be here. And yes, as Mike said, I was the governor of North Dakota for a decade, from 2000 to 2010, and then ran for the Senate and was elected in 2010. So I haven't been here too long. I'm still learning. Got a lot more to learn, too, I can tell. It's an interesting environment here inside the Beltway. I have with me Ryan Bernstein. Ryan works energy issues for me. I'm on the Energy Committee in the Senate. And Ryan's a lawyer, and he did both legal work for me. He was my counsel as governor of North Dakota. And I keep forgetting how long he's been with me, but it's, I'm getting older, so my memory's not so good. But it's been a long time. He could tell you exactly, but it's probably been, 10 years. But he worked for me and helped me in a number of different capacities. So he's somebody I truly trust for any type of advice, being my legal counsel. And I think I actually have 3 or 4 lawyers on my staff now. But he also is really strong on policy, particularly energy issues, which is of great interest to us. North Dakota is now the 4th largest oil-producing state in the United States. I don't know if any of you knew that or cared, but we now produce, we're closing in on 500,000 barrels a day that we produce. Texas, of course, produces the most, then Alaska, then surprisingly California. You wouldn't expect that, would you? California's third, and then North Dakota. And we'll pass up California here pretty soon, and we're closing on Alaska because we're increasing production pretty dramatically. And actually both Alaska and particularly California are have declining production. So we will pass up California. I don't know about Alaska. That's going to depend on some things like, pipelines. Oh yeah, subject for the day, right? There's a lot that goes into energy production that people don't realize. You walk in the room, you turn on the lights come on. You walk in the room, you turn up the heat when it's cold, warms up, or you turn on the air conditioning, it cools off. Where does that come from? How does it happen? Well, it's a tremendously complex engineering marvel, but we just take it for granted, right? And then when you leave the building, you walk outside, you want nice, clean air, you want a good, clean environment, you want clean water, you want cars that run, you want good streets that are made from energy products, the asphalt, concrete, and all that. But it's a technological engineering marvel. It's amazing. And we take it for granted every second, every minute, every day, all the time. But the reality is, unless we continue to develop that engineering, that economic marvel, we won't be able to just take it for granted. We take it for granted both in the fact that it always works, but we also take it for granted from the standpoint that we can afford it. You don't sit and think every day, oh boy, am I going to have enough money to keep the heat on, the lights on, to air condition my home, to, well, maybe sometimes when you put gas in your car, sometimes you think about that because you see $3.50 a gallon, it's posted right there, and you have to physically do it. But there's so many aspects of the energy world that you consume and you never even think about it. And that won't continue to happen unless we continue to make it happen. That's what this hearing's about, and that's why what we do in the public sector is so very, very important, not because we make it happen. We do not. Policymakers think they make jobs happen. Policymakers think they make energy and technology and new products and new processes happen. They do not. They create an environment that empowers those things to happen, or they create an environment that stifles that creativity, that development, that job creation, that energy development, those new technologies that not only produce more energy more cost effectively, but also with better environmental stewardship. It is incumbent upon us, whether you're in the public sector at the local level, at the state level, or at the federal level, to create an environment that empowers the ingenuity, the creativity, and the investment that, oh boy, is that me? Golly. You know, it's funny because I was trying to call him this morning. I couldn't make the phone work. Now it's working pretty good. I'm going to give them both to you. Have a good time if I don't call. We've got to create that environment. That's what really today is about. Now, I understand the panelists may have different points of view, but for right now, I've got the microphone, so you're getting mine. We have got to create an environment that empowers that private investment. And I don't care if you're coming at this from a green perspective, or if you're coming at this from an energy perspective, or the perspective that you love renewables, or the perspective that you love traditional sources of energy, because that debate will go on all day, every day, and I don't know that people with different perspectives will ever completely agree. But the reality is there's room for all of it. And we can make all of it happen in a better way, both from a cost standpoint, from a job creation standpoint, and from an environmental standpoint, if we take the view that we create an environment where we empower investment and creativity that will unleash these new technologies that produce more energy, more cost effectively, with better environmental stewardship, and you know what? make us more self-reliant and less dependent on sources of energy from parts of the world that truly create geopolitical, military, security issues for our nation. And in the case of the Keystone XL Pipeline for the nation of Canada, as well as the United States, which are perhaps the greatest allies, the greatest partners in the world today. Now, you could argue there might be countries that are as strong an allies as Canada and the United States, but it's pretty tough to argue that there are stronger allies than our two countries. So when we talk about finding ways to move ahead with energy, partnering with Canada is a slam dunk. It's a no-brainer. And to do it, we're going to need pipelines. We're going to need infrastructure development, like the Keystone XL Pipeline that TransCanada is proposing to build. Okay, so this panel is going to talk to you about the security aspect, and I understand you'll have a second panel that will talk about the economic perspective. But I'm going to turn that just a little bit from the standpoint that the economic perspective, the economics of this pipeline, drive the security issue. Fundamental. When you look at the Arab Spring today, when you look at what's going on throughout the countries of the Middle East, is that upheaval a military, philosophical, religious upheaval, or is it an economic upheaval? Which is it? You could argue both, right? You have a tremendous number of people, or particularly young people, that have no jobs. A lot of this was started, or initially sparked, literally, when a young man who couldn't sell his wares on the street lit himself in flames in protest, right? Because he couldn't make a living. He and his counterparts did not have jobs. They do not have jobs. So much of this upheaval, whether it's the Middle East or other places, is driven by economics. Do we have jobs? Do you have a form of government that is helping empower and create those jobs or not? So let's just take a few economic stats right off the bat here. And then I'll turn it quickly to the security aspect, and then I better hand off to this panel. Keystone Pipeline, it's a $7 billion investment. $7 billion investment. Now, it'll create 20,000 jobs in the construction phase. Just the construction jobs. 20,000 construction jobs. It will create 250,000 permanent jobs. 250,000 permanent jobs. Let's see. It will spur $100 billion in annual total expenditures in the United States. $100 billion, that's quite a bit. That's more, Michael, than anyone around here gets paid, right? Yeah. So that's a fair amount. It will generate $6.5 billion in new personal income for U.S. workers and their families. $600 million in revenues. This is an interesting one. $600 million in revenues for state and local governments along the way. And obviously, I don't have the income tax figure, but it's going to generate significant federal income tax as well, right? Well, geez, there's that other thing we've heard about, our deficit. You ever hear about that at all these days? And we're constantly going, who are we going to tax more to pay for that deficit? Why not create some wealth? Why not generate some new wealth, generate some jobs, and at the same time help get on top of that deficit? This pipeline will provide 900,000 barrels a day of crude. That's equal to 20% of what we import from OPEC. And I think it almost doubles the amount of product coming into this country from Canada, a very strong ally. And when you look at the United States and you take what we produce in the United States, what we get from Canada and what we get from Mexico, we're between 75 and 80% of our gas consumption. Between 75 and 80% of our gasoline consumption. Now let's add 900,000 barrels a day on top of it. What are we doing? Let's see. We're creating jobs. We're creating tax revenue. We're reducing our dependence on foreign oil. Well, if we're going to get on top of our deficit, if we're going to create more jobs and opportunity in this country, if we're going to continue to try to raise our standard of living, if we're going to address both the economic challenges we face as well as the security challenges we face, isn't this the kind of thing that we need to do? I submit to you that it is. So then you step back and you say, well, why aren't we doing it? Well, this has to go through the regulatory process, both Canada and the United States. And we have very careful and deliberate regulatory processes in both countries. And there is no question that we have to do things right and well, because if we're going to build a pipeline, put it underground, move 900,000 barrels a day of product through it, we have to make sure that there isn't a spill and that we don't contaminate the environment. And this company has gone to great lengths, or TransCanada is going to great lengths to do that and to go through all the regulatory processes to ensure that they do that. But it's very important, and I think this is fundamental to the challenge we face in our country today, and it's not just about this company, because there's one more stat I want to give you. This one. A study released in March by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce says that there are 351 energy projects. 351 energy projects, both renewable and traditional, that are stalled today, at a cost of $1.1 trillion to the American economy and nearly 2 million jobs for the American people. That's the stat from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So now I got to go back to where I started because it's time for me to wrap up. We have to create an environment at the local, state, and federal level in this country that makes sure that we do things right and well, that we protect people and the environment, but that empowers the kind of investment, creativity, and ingenuity that made this country the greatest economic powerhouse in the history of the world, that made us the leader in energy development, that made us a leader in new technologies that protect the environment, produce more energy, and give our people a higher standard of living. We need to have the kind of legal, tax, and regulatory certainty that gets it done, and we need to have people that work in the public sector that understand it is their job to make sure things are done right and well, but at the end of the day, that they're done, that they're not stopped, that they're not sidelined, that we don't have gridlock, and that we don't continue to languish, but that we make those investments, we empower our businesses and our innovators, and we continue to grow and develop and add jobs and lead the way forward in terms of economic development for this country and for the world. So I think this is one example of what this project is all about. Find a way to get it done. Find a way to get it done right and well, not just because it's important from a security issue, because we need the energy, we need to be more self-reliant, reliant on ourselves and our allies, but because it will create tremendous opportunity for our country as well. Thanks so much for inviting me to be here. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Senator Hoeven. Congressman Green is about to be here if he's not here. But what we'll do is get started on the program, and when he comes, we'll move things over. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Louisa Savage, who was with Maclean's Magazine, Canada's national news weekly. Louisa also has a blog called bilateralist.com, which looks at the Canada-U.S. relationship, and it's quite thorough most of the time. She's got some really good links to articles of things that are going on all over the place, and interviews, and some more longer thought pieces as well. So let me turn this over to Louisa, and then I'll give you a sign when the congressman comes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you to the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Canada Institute for this gathering that comes right as the State Department is in the middle, as David pointed out, of going through a 90-day review of the national interest in building this pipeline Just to set the stage, as we know, in September '08, TransCanada applied for a presidential permit to build the 1,700-mile, $7 billion pipeline that could transport 700,000 to 900,000 barrels per day into the U.S. That was September '08, so that's been 3 years. And the reason it's been taking so long, I think we had a politician in Alberta say, why doesn't Obama just sign the bloody order? Well, the reason is there's a legally mandated bureaucratic review process that's being done. And there's been a very lengthy environmental impact statement process. Basically, the State Department did a draft environmental impact statement. The EPA said, not good enough, went back, did another one. EPA said, we still have questions, went back, did another one. And finally, on August 26th, we got a final environmental impact statement. That concluded there'd be no major environmental impacts along the pipeline route as long as TransCanada met certain conditions. Interestingly, it also assumed that the oil sands resource would be developed one way or another. And therefore, it found that permitting the pipeline would not itself add to upstream carbon emissions. And I know some people in this room disagree with that conclusion. So environmentalists obviously have had a lot of concerns. There were more than 1,000 protesters this summer who had themselves arrested in front of the White House, including a few celebrities you may have seen on television. And environmental groups have also said that if this permit is approved, they will challenge it in court. So now the State Department is looking at the national interest determination. There will be a 90-day comment period for 8 federal agencies to give their views and a separate comment period for the public that runs until October 9th. They're accepting written comments as well as holding public meetings along the pipeline route. That'll be translated into a memo to the Secretary of State, and she'll decide, or she'll designate someone to decide whether or not to permit the pipeline. And that is to be done by the end of this calendar year. Interestingly, once that decision is made, it's not necessarily the end. There will be 2 weeks for 8 federal agencies that are legally permitted to raise objections. If one of these agencies raises an objection to the permit, it goes to the president himself. So what criteria will the State Department use to determine whether this pipeline is in the national interest? Well, they've said there's no mathematical formula for this evaluation, but they'll be guided by some factors that have been used in the past, including what impacts will it have on the diversity of supply to meet U.S. crude oil demand? What about the stability of the trading partners? What about the impact of the project on broader foreign policy objectives, including a comprehensive strategy to address climate change? As well as what are the economic benefits to the U.S. of constructing and operating the project? I think it's become clear to everyone at this point that the pipeline issue right now has become more than a debate over the physical pipeline, but it's also a symbol for oil sands development and what role the United States wants the oil sands to play in its energy future. Supporters say, look, this is conflict-free oil. It's like those Yukon diamonds. This is quote-unquote ethical oil. This is reliable oil. We're your great ally. It'll contribute to jobs. Critics say, no, it's dirty oil. There's a bigger carbon footprint. The pipeline is at risk of dangerous leaks. It crosses ecologically sensitive areas, including a major aquifer in Nebraska. And most importantly, it would lock the United States into dependency on fossil fuels. I think the big question for our panel today is, in part, will it matter at all to national security, to energy security, given that oil is traded on a global market? And if the United States doesn't buy the oil from the Middle East but from Canada, someone else will. As long as the United States is consuming fossil fuels, it's adding to the demand for fossil fuels, and it's continuing to line the pockets of Middle Eastern regimes and those that would support terrorists, among other forms of hostility to the United States. So I think that's the overarching tension, and I'm hoping our panelists will shed some light on it. So each one is going to give a brief presentation, and we'll begin with Paul Sullivan. He is a professor of economics at the National Defense University and an adjunct professor of security studies at Georgetown, where he teaches on energy, water, and security issues. And he has extensive experience in the Middle East, so he has a really great perspective on this topic.
Well, good morning. I have to give a caveat every time I speak in public. These are my opinions alone, do not represent those of the National Defense University, Georgetown, the U.S. government, or anyone else I might be associated with. The most important relationship the U.S. has is with our stable, peaceful, developing, and democratic neighbor to the north, Canada. Good start. All right, I don't have to say that sentence then.
All right, we're going to yield the floor.
We're very happy to have Congressman Gene Green here. He is a native, I believe, of Houston, and he's had 40 years of elective office. 20 of those years in the State House of Representatives and State Senate, I believe, and since 1992 has been in the U.S. House of Representatives representing the 29th District of Texas. Congressman, thank you for being here.
First of all, I apologize for being late. You'd think after being in my 10th term I would find my way around Washington, but y'all know that movie, The American President. I feel like I was on DuPont Circle trying to find a parking place here in the Woodrow Wilson building. But I'm happy to be here. My name is Gene Green. I represent a district in Houston. It's a very urban district, very blue collar. It's actually the largest petrochemical complex in the country, second largest in the world. I physically represent 5 refineries, and we have very large refineries. And so that's the concern I have, and that's why I support the pipeline. In fact, through our committee, I've been on the Energy and Commerce Committee since 1997. Our refineries, our country needs the refined product that we produce, not only in the Houston area but along the Gulf Coast. And that pipeline will give us another option compared to what we're doing in importing oil from other parts of the world, some that are not so friendly. Best example I have is that for many years in the 90s, I have a refinery, Lyondale Refinery, and they signed a contract with PDVSA, which is a Venezuelan oil company in the 90s, to upgrade their refinery to handle heavy Venezuelan crude, which is even lighter than what we'd see coming from Canada. But you can do that. You can redo that. $2 billion investment in the 1990s. PDVSA took a 40% ownership in that refinery. That's since been bought out by Lyondale, which is a combination European, U.S. company. So we do that. We do heavier crude. Obviously, cheaper to refine light, sweet crude. But most of the crude oil we're getting is from areas that have heavier crude, and that's why it's so important. Create about 6,000 jobs in the pipeline creation. Of course, coming from Houston, people worry about living on a pipeline. I've never not lived on a pipeline easement in my area. That's just the nature of our system, whether it be natural gas pipeline, refined product pipeline, or even a crude oil pipeline. So that's why the importance. Our nation needs that crude oil. We need the refined products. And I always explain to people, if we take 60% of our crude now as imported, why would we not want to replace some of that 60% from our closest neighbor to the north? And also, since I represent those refineries are not going to get any exemption for burning heavier crude oil. They're going to have to meet our environmental standards as they are now. It's easier to do light sweet. It's cleaner. But you also you have to prepare for dealing with heavier crude, and we have that experience in our refineries in our area. The pipeline actually would, the end of it, would just be east of our district. We had a public hearing about a year and a half ago in Channelview, Texas, that I requested the State Department to do, so our constituents could know what it is. But again, pipelines are not unusual in our area. We have them everywhere. Serving on the Energy and Commerce Committee, my frustration is that we build pipelines across our country all the time. It's typically regulated by the Department of Transportation. But in this case, it's the Department of State because it's an international pipeline. And this particular permit has taken much longer than previous international pipelines. And again, we're not talking about a pipeline from, Venezuela or Iran. We're talking about a pipeline from Canada, which is, again, our closest neighbor. And I know there's a lot of opposition to it based on the heavier crude, and it will continue our hydrocarbon economy. Again, I go back, I represent 5 refineries. I really don't want those refineries shut down. Our country needs that crude oil to refine the product. And I explain to people, if we don't refine it in our country, just think how much of a problem we would have on national security if we had to import our refined products instead of just importing our crude oil. So, like I said, I represent a very blue-collar district. That's what we do. We refine products. I have, like I said, 5 refineries, about 20 chemical plants. And we're the second largest in the world. The first one is actually in Rotterdam. So we have a very European country that has a bigger petrochemical complex than we do in Houston, Texas, and East Harris County. So with that, I'll be glad to answer any questions, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Are there any questions for Congressman Green? Looks like you can go back and find your copy.
Oh, my gosh. Having had some entertaining town hall meetings in 2009, I need all of you to come to our town hall since there's no shortage of questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman.
Thank you.
So I will pick up where we left off, and I think Paul was giving his disclaimers about.
Well, I
that's-
finished
and I
the
will
disclaimer.
turn it over to him.
Our most important military-to-military relations, and remember I work at the National Defense University, I kind of know about these things, are with the Canadians. Our most important international trading relations are with the Canadians. Our most important energy relations are with the Canadians. We trade electricity, natural gas, and oil across our borders and have important energy efficiency and alternative energy joint programs. They are our largest source of imported oil, and if the pipeline goes through, will be an even more important and vitally stable source of oil in the future. The oil output from Alberta tar sands is expected to grow close to 4 to 6 million barrels a day in the coming years. Most of that could be coming to the U.S., not just through this pipeline, but through others. Ladies and gentlemen, there are pipelines built every year. This one has a fixation to it, it seems, publicly. If we allow it, this oil can come to us. The Canadians will also logically be developing other markets for their oil, especially in Asia and particularly quickly growing China. There could be considerable competition for the tar sands in Alberta as the conventional oil begins to further dwindle and the cost of new production of conventional oil continues to climb. Consider the huge expenses that will be involved in exploring for, producing, and transporting oil from the Arctic and ultra-deep water, and you begin to get the picture of what the alternatives might look like. Alberta tar sands are a massive resource right near our border and a massive source of oil that could easily be accessible to U.S. industry, commerce, and consumers for many years to come. And it will be a stable source. Stability is important, especially considering how much instability there is in the most important oil supply and oil transport areas in the Middle East. The senator mentioned the Arab Spring. I've been living the Arab Spring since January, 80 hours a day. The Arab Spring awakening is far from over. Frankly, we have been very lucky so far that the Arab Spring occurred during slow growth periods in the EU and the US, the two largest consumers of oil in the world. The situation in Libya is far from certain. Gaddafi has not been caught yet, and who the leadership might be is not clear, and there's significant risk of intertribal warfare and a splitting of that country, media opinion aside. The oil shocks that could have come out of the revolution in Egypt proved to be far less than expected. There was a significant sigh of relief when the Egyptian army essentially saved the country by moving Mr. Mubarak out. However, much like what the senator mentioned, the situation in Egypt and throughout the region is quite uncertain because of the mass unemployment and frustration amongst the youth and what that might lead to. If we're going to look at the Suez Canal and the Sumed pipeline in Egypt, 2 to 3 million barrels a day crosses through. This could be quite a shock if Egypt heads south, and we cannot rule that out. Egypt and Libya falling back into even greater violence and chaos is not out of the picture. Again, not out of the picture. Algeria has all the signs of a country that might be next in the Arab Spring. It produces quite a bit more oil than Libya did prior to its revolution. And if Algeria goes, it will be far bloodier and much longer lasting than what is happening in Libya. Algeria also exports a lot of oil to the east coast of Canada. It also exports far more oil to the U.S. than Libya did. Algeria is Canada's largest trading partner in Africa. Syria, Yemen, and Bahrain are not major oil producers, but they are strategically placed in the region. Enough so that if things go badly, the oil markets could be shocked. Bahrain, Yemen, and Syria are also focal points for the growing Shia-Sunni tensions in the region. these tensions could be the biggest source of risk to oil markets anywhere. And that would be focused on the GCC-Iran tensions. If all this is not enough, about 8% of the global cargo trade goes through the Bab el-Mandeb off of Yemen, and 3 million barrels a day passes through there. Yemen is bookended with Somalia in the world of potentially failing states, and could be a complementary source of pirates and terrorists that could target the energy industry and traffic, facilities and so forth, and not just there. Then we have the 800-pound caribou in the room, Saudi Arabia. It is our second largest source of imported oil and the source of the largest reserves of conventional oil in the world, and it has 80% of the excess capacity available in the world. If Saudi Arabia heads south, the prices of oil will head way north, and I will invest in bicycle companies. Iran is a wild card. As Ahmadinejad loses his political clout and the chasms built in that country, there could be considerable instability in Iran. And Iran is a major exporter of oil. Then, of course, there is Iraq, where 90% of their exports go through one oil facility. ABOT, the Al-Basra oil terminal, terrorism target #1 in the world. If that's hit, oil markets will be shocked, prices will rocket high, and the Iraqi economy will be devastated, which will lead to economic effects, leading to further instability in Iraq, and just work it through from there. Moving to another part of the world where we get a lot of our light sweet crude, Nigeria, they're certainly facing down insurgencies and interreligious conflict, as well as the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta. That group regularly attacks oil wells and kidnaps oil workers, and you can actually follow the price of oil as each and every one of these events occurs. Angola, another major source of oil to our country, has increasing instability because of the unequal use of the oil revenues within that country, and it's really just starting to get out of a 27-year vicious civil war. These are not stable places for oil. 55% of oil comes from the Western Hemisphere, but most of our non-Canadian sources in the Western Hemisphere are not exactly looking like growth projects. Mexican production, particularly in the Cantarell field, has been dreadfully south over the last few years. And Venezuelan production through PDVSA has been going downhill pretty much since Hugo Chavez took over. Even with its massive heavy oil reserves, Venezuela is facing declines. It's a poorly run company. Most of its profits go to the social programs of Hugo Chavez and not to investment and maintenance, which is required. Amongst the top 5 oil reserve holders in the world, Canada is the only one that is not a member of OPEC. About 78% of the world's crude oil reserves are owned by national oil companies. 50% of what is left is in Canada, and 97% of that is in the tar sands. We can have greater access to that oil with this pipeline. But it's not just the pipeline that is at issue. It's the future energy security, economic security, and national security, all interrelated for this country and for Canada. Having open and easy access to a giant energy source like this could be a very big part of our energy security future. It is also the future of economic security in this country. We have a stagnant economy in this country with an official unemployment rate of 9.1%. Officially, we have 14 million people out of work. Many of them have families, children to take care of. About 50% of our unemployed have been long-term unemployed. 50%. That's the highest in the last 5 decades. Millions have given up looking for work. It could be with that combination of unemployment and underemployment, we could have 22 to 25 million of our people unemployed. And that would affect 3 to 4 times that number of people through their families. We need to get our people to work. We also need a growing and developing economy to afford our defense and security needs, both internal and external, and of course to pay our massive, crushing debt. The increasing production of tar sands oil all can have a tendency to moderate world prices of oil in the face of the turmoil and instability, only a part of which I spoke about. The increased production of tar sands oil could also tend to move potential excess production, and this is important, from the Middle East, from OPEC, to Canada. It could also, in combination with our oil shales and shale oils in our own tar sands in Utah, move that excess capacity and the entire power center of oil and energy to North America within the next 20 years. That's a huge change. My sense is that many against this pipeline are simply against oil, and I suppose I can understand that perspective. But 30% or 37% of our energy needs come from oil, and to move rapidly from oil to these alternative energies, which frankly I support as well for electricity production and so forth, is fantastical if you think it's going to happen anytime quickly. Things are being looked at backwards. First, people have to look at changing the transportation technology, then start looking at changing the energy that goes into them. 85% of the energy we put into our transport vehicles is wasted, and for the typical automobile, 0.3% of the energy put into the gas tank is actually used to move the person in the car. We should change the way we drive and what we drive way before we try to shut down the important arteries of energy that could be used for our transportation systems. A lot of people are talking about electrical cars. What would happen if there were a blackout? Think about it, folks. It not only would be that your refrigerator and your lights would be off, the entire transportation network would shut down. That's something to consider. Things take time. I know there are difficult and emotional trade-offs involved with this issue, and I think about those just about every day. However, we cannot allow the idealistic to be the enemy of the practical. We need to be reasonable. We need Canadian oil for some time to come, and we need ways to get it to us. This pipeline connecting us to our ally, Canada, is not the giant step toward a new energy future that many would like. However, this pipeline could help secure our needs for the medium term as the U.S. begins its very complex quest to find sustainable and attainable energy security in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That was rather depressing. All that instability. We're going to hold our follow-up questions until we get through the whole panel. So next, it's Lou Pugliaresi, who is president of Energy Policy Research Foundation, which has published several reports on the Canadian oil sands and the Keystone XL Pipeline. He's worked as an energy consultant and worked in government in a variety of posts, including at the National Security Council at the White House, the Departments of State, Energy and Interior, and the EPA. Lou?
Okay.
Over to you.
Well, let me just give you a little background. EPRINC, many of you may know us as PIRINC, Petroleum Industry Research Foundation. We've been around since 1944. I think we're probably pretty strong. We do a lot of petro-nerd stuff in the downstream sector, but we have been doing a lot of upstream work in the last 5 or 6 years. Our board changed the name actually from PIRINC to EPRINC, thinking most of the interesting petroleum issues had been solved. I don't think the day after they made that change, the only thing we worked on was petroleum issues. And what I thought I'd do today is give us a kind of intellectual framework to think about, what is energy security, because people have a lot of different definitions of it, and we have a very specific view. We tend to think of the world like economists. Energy security really is a concentration of low-cost reserves in relatively unstable parts of the world. And this and because we live in a world oil market, this imposes 2 costs on the United States. First cost is we end up paying more for oil than we would pay in more competitive markets when the concentration wasn't so focused in a few countries. And secondly, it subjects us to volatility, and that imposes economic damage to the economy when oil prices spike. And the overall higher prices of oil also cause us to have large wealth transfers. So this is the kind of cost on the national economy. This is kind of how we think about how we think about energy security. The second thing I'd like to talk about today a little bit is the role of expectations. If you go to 73, 74 Arab oil embargo, the amount of oil lost from the world oil market was very small. It was almost, maybe 100,000 barrels a day, but the price spiked. But the price spiked not because of conditions in the prompt market, but expectations about future rate of growth from the Persian Gulf. Those expectations came way down. If you look at the 79 Iranian Revolution, once again, the amount of oil lost from the market was small, but there was a shift in expectations among buyers and sellers on the rate of growth of new production from Iraq and Iran. So expectations are very important. I want you to think about that because that's a big piece of what we're going to do which affects how we think about the policy choices. And the other issue, of course, is false choices. Now, I sort of get it about alternative energy, and we think projects that have good rates of return should be funded, and those that not, well, we see what happens to them in the case of Solyndra and other places. The interesting thing about petroleum projects now in the United States and Canada is that they have high net value. They provide sustainable growth. It's not really employment so much, but how do you get sustainable growth? If you have high-valued projects with high rates of return, with lots of net value, they generate cash, state and local governments, return on capital, and wages and employment. But the real issue about imports is it doesn't really, you don't really have a choice. If you don't use the Canadian oil, you're going to import oil from somewhere else. I won't go through all the well-to-wheels data, but if you look at the data from CIRA and some other folks, it's unclear that there's any kind of net penalty to the environment through the Canadian oil. And we can have that discussion in more detail. But the real question is to worry about false choices. We have these imports, and if we don't buy the Canadian oil, we'll buy it from somebody else. And within the range of what we're talking about, at least for the next few years, the next 10 years or so, that's going to be the dominant theme in any analysis you would do. Now, we talked a little bit about expectations. We already have a large and expansive energy trade with the Canadians. We have been buying Canadian oil for a long time. If the Canadian oil were put on a tanker, the only federal official that would see this oil is the customs officer in Houston Harbor. Okay, it's the only reason it's a big deal is because it's actually crossing the border and it's moving by pipeline, in which all the historical data indicate is considerably safer than moving it by tanker. I mean, that's just an artifact of the policy process. And so one of the important benefits of the pipeline, at least to us, is that it sends a signal to the Canadians that the long-term energy relationship is preserved, that people in Canada, investors in Canada, can make long-term commitments, and they know that the North American market is open to them. That set of expectations among buyers and sellers is very, very important. The other sort of security, if you like, or the integration of security and economic benefits is the shifting production in the United States and the efficiency that the Keystone XL Pipeline delivers to the distribution of crude oil within the United States. We have a large project underway on Bakken. We also have a project on Iraq, and anyone who's interested can go to our website and read it in great detail. But, as the Senator pointed out, we have a high rate of growth in North Dakota production. But that production is somewhat stranded. The value of Bakken crude oil, which is a very light, sweet crude oil, you can literally, I have seen producers and farmers in North Dakota take Bakken crude oil and stick it in a diesel generator, and they're able to get it to fire up. I wouldn't recommend it, but I'm just saying it's a very light, sweet crude oil. That crude oil is discounting and the wellhead values in North Dakota, $30 a barrel. We need to get the efficiency in the crude oil system to move that to the refiners in which it's most valuable. And the other thing that Congressman Green talked about, if you look at the down here, and the red is of course, all the gas production, this is the Baker Hughes show where all the rigs are displayed. But down here in the Gulf Coast, that's where the heavy, complex refiners are. The Canadian crude oil is a good match to the cokers and complex refineries in the deep Gulf. It gives you a lot of efficiency in the processing of crude oil. This shows you what's been happening in the Williston Basin. It's quite a remarkable development. Even through the bad winter, production jumped in the last 60 days by 50,000 barrels a day. This production needs to be moved, and the Keystone Pipeline provides a lot of efficiencies for that. Now, I don't know if too many people have seen this chart, but what you need to understand is, you see the green and the blue, they represent U.S. and Canadian production. The middle of the country of the United States no longer has any imported oil. But the production is starting to move up here to North Dakota. We need to find ways, if we're going to efficiently reduce our imports, if we're going to gain kind of all the benefits of growing production in the United States, we need to move that production from the middle of the country out to the pads which are experiencing large imports. By the way, the most distressed refining sector in the United States is in Pad 1, here on the East Coast. Lots of imports of petroleum products from Europe. Pad 1 may enjoy a renaissance as the Bakken production starts to move east instead of south. As the large cokers in the deep Gulf take the Canadian oil, we may now see the Bakken crude move to the East Coast. There's going to be announcements of some shipments in the coming days. Now, I'll leave you with one. We are members of the National Petroleum Council. We do a lot of stuff on the downstream side. And there was a lot of discussion about what North America can do. And once again, so the real issue isn't so much the level of imports, but how do you get sustainable growth? How do you shift expectations? And this is an interesting development. The NPC just released this on Monday, and you can see that there are two futures here, the high potential and the limited. The high potential actually is a combination of Canadian oil sands, which is really the anchor to make this thing work, Deepwater Gulf, Alaska. But under the estimates done by the National Petroleum Council, North America can produce over 20 million barrels a day. It is quite an amazing shift. A lot of this has to do with the movement of the application of natural gas technology to oil technology, to oil development. So we have the hydrofracking, the tight gas, now moving to tight oil. And we're going to see crude oil production from Ohio in the coming years. We're going to see crude oil production expand in Texas, even the Permian Basin. Even the San Joaquin Basin in California. So in my last minute, let me take you through the takeaways. The first thing to keep in mind is petroleum is a big piece of the American economy. So if you can shift the long-run price of oil by $20 a barrel against whatever your forecast price is, present value savings to the national economy is $1 trillion. You cannot get those numbers with any other energy source. We're going to continue to have petroleum embedded extensively within the American economy, and it's in the interest of the United States to have a lower rather than a higher oil price. Keystone generates, as we said, large economic benefits in both efficiency and both in the distribution of crude and processing. Supports sustainable economic growth. The notion that we should move to renewables instead of Canadian crude oil sands is a false choice. I think we all understand that now. And the other thing I like to think about is this problem of failure risk. I think Solyndra is kind of the leading edge of that. If you look at our work and we say, look, if the long-run price of oil is not as high as you think, right, you're going to have a lot of technologies out there that are subject to catastrophic financial failure. Everything from electric cars to ethanol to sort of exotic biofuels. And so that the Canadian, having a strategy which transitions to the fuels of the future on a slower pace, generates large economic benefits, and also reduces the risk of catastrophic failure of some of these alternatives. And I'll just leave it there.
Thank you very much. Our next panelist is Lauren Stockman, and he is the research director for Oil Change International. Before that, he was a consultant for Greenpeace UK. His most recent publication examines the export strategies of the key refineries positioned to receive the tar sands crude from Keystone XL. So he brings a different perspective. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you. Is this working? Thank you. I feel a little bit the odd one out here because not only am I not North American, but I'm also the only person here questioning some of the assumptions about this pipeline. I think, when we talk about energy security, we're primarily talking about two things. We're talking about security from supply disruptions and security from the effects of price volatility on our economy. And I would argue this pipeline doesn't do much for either of those. My three main points today are going to be that the Keystone XL Pipeline is an export pipeline. Canadian oil has not and cannot insulate America from oil supply disruptions or oil price shocks, and that the U.S. oil market is actually shrinking. Enhancing the ongoing demand decline is the only genuine energy security strategy available to us. We produced a report a couple of weeks ago. It's out on the table. I'm sorry it wasn't there when you all arrived. I had trouble with the metro this morning. But we examined the fundamental structural shifts in the market that are going on in the U.S. today. When this pipeline was proposed, demand was growing, U.S. oil demand was growing, and production was declining. That's now completely the other way around. U.S. oil demand is now declining, and U.S. oil production is increasing. This is a chart from a Deutsche Bank Global Markets Research report from December 2010. Where they examined, where they forecast the decline in gasoline demand between now and 2030. This was based on the assumptions, based on the CAFE standards enacted by the Obama administration, the first set, and an expectation of 52 mpg in the most recent announcements. We actually got 54.5 mpg. So possibly the gasoline demand decline could be more severe than that. It's a slow decline in the next decade, but it's a much more severe decline in the 2020s. What's been happening over the last couple of years, as there has been demand decline in this country, we've seen U.S. exports of petroleum products increase by 60% since 2007. They're now at 2.3 million barrels a day. The green part of that chart are diesel and distillates. What's basically going on is we haven't got growth in diesel consumption in this country. Europe has a diesel deficit. Latin America has a petroleum products deficit generally, and we're increasingly exporting our surplus to these countries. As I said, it reached 2.3 million barrels a day this year, and it's forecast by the EIA to continue to increase for the foreseeable future. We examined some of the strategies of the refiners who have committed to Keystone XL deliveries. Valero is the biggest refiner in the country. It's also the company that's committed the most to the most amount of crude from the Keystone XL Pipeline. And this is a slide from one of their investor presentations. They just bought a refinery in the UK from which they intend to import gasoline. And the red line is diesels and jet fuel, primarily diesel that's going out from their Gulf Coast refineries to Latin America and to Europe. And they basically see this, if you read the whole presentation, they see, gasoline demand in decline in the US. The area for growth for them, for their business, is to increase these diesel exports. That's their strategy going forward. Not only that, but the actual equipment that they're putting into the refinery, the main refinery that Valero will receive the Keystone crude in the Port Arthur refinery, they're spending $1.5 billion on a hydrocracker. And you can see in the highlighted areas, this piece of equipment is designed not only to process the heavy sour Canadian crude, they've also told their investors they can configure this piece of equipment for a very high yield of diesel, as opposed to common equipment in refineries where you get a much more even breakdown of gasoline, diesel, and other products. They've told investors they can configure these things to yield over 90% diesel. And clearly in the slide, their intention for that diesel is to export it into the growing export market. So I think we really have to question the energy security claims about this pipeline. If we have declining demand in this country and we have refineries that, in order to stay in business, want to take this crude and export it onto the international market. Also, if they're doing that, there's no real basis which to assume that they'll import less crude from other places. They're exporting this crude. They're exporting these products. They're keeping their demand very high in the face of declining consumption in the U.S. There are other refineries on the Gulf Coast and, as you said, on the East Coast who are dependent on imports from Venezuela, the Middle East, West Africa. This pipeline doesn't really change that. So I also want to talk about whether Canadian oil has been bringing any real energy security benefit to the United States. This is a chart of the proven oil reserves, the distribution of those around the world. As somebody mentioned earlier, 77%, 78% is in the hands of OPEC. Canada has 2.3%. This is the fundamental fact behind the global reserve situation, and why Canadian oil hasn't really insulated America from oil price spikes or supply disruptions in recent years. In 2008, we had a lot of Canadian oil coming in. It was already the largest source of imports. Prices spiked. Gas prices at the pump spiked above $4 a barrel. Just this year, we saw the Libyan crisis. Libyan oil was shut off. Inventories and stocks in this country were at a record high. There had never been so much oil sitting in tanks in the U.S. in history at the time the Libyan crisis hit. What happened? Oil prices spiked. Gas prices spiked. We were importing 2.8 million barrels a day of Canadian crude and products, twice as much as we're getting from Saudi Arabia, 30% more than we're getting from the entire Middle East. Was there a price buffer or a cushion effect from these imports? It didn't seem to be in evidence. The issue of supply disruption. If there's a big supply disruption, will Canadian oil be able to make up the gap? I mean, if the Canadian oil will be pumping 2, 3, 4 million barrels a day, there's no spare capacity in the system. If we do have a disruption and a lot of oil is taken out in the Middle East, the Straits of Hormuz are closed, the Canadians can't just ramp up production. It takes billions of dollars and a lot of time to put in new infrastructure to increase oil production. So really the only supply disruption buffer we have is the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which we created in the 1970s in reaction to the oil crisis then. It can provide 4 million barrels a day for up to 90 days, and that's really our supply disruption buffer. That's what we've had, and that's potentially effective, but it won't ease prices. You can pump as much oil out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in a supply disruption as you like, but fundamentally the market is global, and the oil price will go through the roof, and we're still dependent. Our economy remains dependent on that oil, and those effects are still there. So I want to talk about one of the things that really will bring energy security. It's not a short-term plan. It's clearly a long-term plan. But we've already stepped along that path. President Obama has enacted CAFE standards that have put this country on the path to an oil demand decline. We need to do a lot more, but we are on that path, and that's what brings us energy security. If you look at what the International Energy Agency produces in its World Energy Outlook every year, it does two scenarios. Kind of the CPS, the blue block on the graph, is the current policy scenario. That's where this is global oil demand. Well, that's the growth between 2011 and 2035. If we freeze policies where they are today, we don't enact any further policies to improve efficiency, to address climate change, or any of to address energy security. Alternatively, they do a 450 scenario in which global energy demand is constrained in order to protect the climate, keep atmospheric concentrations of carbon at 450 ppm, and prevent catastrophic climate change. That would see a 10% decrease in global oil demand between now and 2035. And the IEA is very clear that oil is absolutely essential to address oil use in order to mitigate climate change. Climate mitigation strategies that do not tackle oil use will fail in the longer term. And that's absolutely clear. And I would argue, we never mention climate in this energy security debate, but it is. The Center for Naval Analysis has produced several reports. Several people in the Pentagon have produced a raft of reports. They see climate change as a security threat to this country, as a threat multiplier across the world, and as something that the U.S. troops are going to be facing and dealing with in the coming decades. So climate change is a security issue, but it's almost totally ignored in this debate. What happens if we follow that IEA 450 scenario and protect climate change? We get a 30% cut in U.S. oil use against the reference scenario. U.S. imports of oil are cut by 45%. That's from everywhere. Canada, the Middle East, they're cut. There's a 25% demand cut globally, and there's a 30% drop in tar sands production because tar sands production is actually quite expensive. And when you stabilize demand, you stabilize oil prices, and a lot of tar sands production that's scheduled to come on stream doesn't materialize. And the other thing, another concern that we hear in the energy security debate is how much money we're sending to OPEC countries and countries that are hostile to America. Well, if we buy oil from Canada, we might divert, in the next couple of decades, a couple of $100 billion. Under that scenario, $5 trillion of revenue to OPEC is cut. And I would say that's much more significant. So just to conclude, I'd say that Canada and the industry is selling a false hope for energy security. There simply isn't evidence that Canadian oil or the pipeline actually address any specific energy security issues, and that only demand reduction weakens OPEC, weakens OPEC's power and enhances energy security. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. And our final speaker is Alexander Pourbet, and he is the head of energy and oil pipelines for TransCanada. So over to you. You've got about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Okay, thanks very much, and thank everyone for the opportunity to speak today. I thought I was going to have trouble getting done in 10 or 12 minutes, but so much of my presentation has been taken up by the previous speakers, I probably will be able to. I just wanted to start off by reinforcing a few facts about the U.S. current energy environment. The U.S. is right now the number one consumer of oil in the world, consuming almost 20 million barrels of oil and refined products a day. And according to the EIA, this consumption trend is expected to continue for some time in the future. Meanwhile, as you've heard from the other speakers, Canada has an abundance of reserves, and as this chart indicates, ranks third in the world, only behind Saudi Arabia and Venezuela for proven reserves. Canada has about 175 billion barrels of proved reserves. About 97% of those are in the oil sands, with an estimate of more than 1.7 trillion barrels of oil in place. And one point I would make, and I think it's kind of missed a lot in this debate, is that it isn't just Canada's crude is largely heavy oil, but in fact, the entire slate of world production is increasingly moving to heavy production as the light sweet barrels have been found and produced. Today, we export about 2 million barrels of oil a day to the U.S. About two-thirds of that is the oil sands. And unlike almost every other oil-producing country on the planet, Canada is one of the only countries that has the ability to significantly increase its crude oil production in the coming years. Overall, we expect oil sands production growth is going to reach 2 million barrels by 2015 and could get as high as 3.5 million barrels a day by 2020. And I wanted to make a point. Lauren made the comment that if the U.S. is successful in implementing demand reduction strategies in the U.S., there may be no need whatsoever for Keystone XL, and I would say absolutely. One of the real beautiful things about Keystone XL is that it is 100% financed by TransCanada and our shippers. If by chance 10 years from now the U.S. finds that it needs 50% less oil, that's not a big deal. Keystone, in that case, will run empty, and it does not pose any burden or barrier on any American. So just something to keep in mind. I think one of the things that I want to talk about is just a little bit about the oil sands. The oil sands have very significant benefits, not just for Canada, but also for the U.S. Investment in the oil sands is creating huge opportunities for the U.S. Just to give you a couple of figures. For every 2 jobs created in Canada from the oil sands, 1 job is created in the U.S. After Alberta, the economy which receives the greatest benefits from the oil sands is the United States. And the estimate is that oil sands investment and operations are expected to contribute somewhere over $500 billion to U.S. GDP by 2035. and in addition, significant numbers of jobs. So we've talked a little bit about where we are in this process. We're in the national interest determination, where the State Department assesses the questions of the environment, national security, and the broader impact on the U.S. economy. Let's be clear. Oil sands imports will displace OPEC imports. The actual number is that Keystone XL alone has the ability to reduce OPEC imports by up to 40% annually. We're obviously, Canada's a very friendly nation, and the oil sands are part of the largest trade relationship on earth. And the U.S. and Canada share principles of freedom and democracy. And we also want to talk just for a second about political disruption and upheaval. Obviously, Canada is not remotely subject to the kind of pressures that you heard Paul talk about earlier. One of the comments that was made that I think is worth noting is that 79% of the world's oil reserves are controlled by national state oil companies. Of the 21% left on the planet, the oil sands represent half of those reserves that are available to private investment. Let's talk a little bit about the benefit that development of the oil sands can bring to the U.S. With increasingly high oil prices, more and more U.S. wealth is shifting to other countries that are less stable or friendly to the U.S. And I really think it is an issue of energy security. If you take a look at the other countries that export oil to the U.S., they're largely countries that do not share the values or the principles of the U.S. And a great case in point that we heard earlier is Venezuela. We've obviously seen Hugo Chavez. He has made it a priority to move his oil exports from the U.S. To Canada. In fact, companies like Valero, who you heard Lauren talk about, have already been told that their contracts with Venezuela are not going to be renewed, and that is why they came to Canada to try to get connected to the oil sands. Oil produced in Canada brings very significant GDP benefits to America. If you think about it, 1 million barrels a day from produced in North America reduces cash flows to overseas suppliers by $33 billion annually, creates $33 billion worth of stimulus to the North American economy, drives $100 billion of incremental GDP growth through multiplier effects, including valuable infrastructure projects much like Keystone XL. And I thought what I'd do for a second is just shift to the Keystone XL project. I think everybody's aware that we are involved in this incredible effort to permit one of the largest infrastructure projects in North America in decades. The Keystone project, which you see depicted here in orange, is one of the largest market-driven solutions to deliver at full production. This can deliver up to 1.5 million barrels of oil from the Alberta oil sands, and I think very importantly from the Bakken oil fields to U.S. refineries, offsetting those imports from less stable regimes. If you take a look at phases 1 and 2 are in service. That's represented by the solid orange lines. And we're in the process of seeking approval for Keystone XL, which is represented by the dashed orange lines. I think there really is no infrastructure project today remotely that is more meaningful to secure the energy security of the U.S. than the Keystone Pipeline system. As you heard earlier, refineries in the U.S. Midwest are reaching a saturation point for their ability to accept Canadian crude, and Keystone XL will expand the ability of pipeline capacity to reach these very vital refineries in the U.S. Gulf Coast. As you heard before, these Gulf Coast refineries have largely made the multi-billion-dollar investments in technology to enable them to run slates of heavier crudes that they've been receiving from Venezuela and Mexico. And this project will allow those refineries to continue to consume the heavier crudes that they were designed to run. And I think another thing that's important, and this is something that the opponents of this project don't like to talk about, At the end of the day, if the Keystone XL project is not approved, the oil sands will continue to be developed. That oil will almost certainly, it'll go to other markets, almost certainly China, and the U.S. Gulf Coast refiners will continue to import heavy oil, most likely increasingly from the Middle East. But this incredibly secure and stable resource could potentially be lost to the U.S. for decades. I was going to talk about the economic stimulus and job creation, but I think Senator Hoeven had a better grasp of the numbers than I did, so I'm going to just I'll pass on that. I do want to talk just very briefly about safety as I finish up. The opponents of Keystone XL have made a number of allegations about Keystone XL and pipelines in general. They've suggested that pipelines are inherently unsafe, they are bound to leak, they will create environmental disasters. With all due respect, this is just not true. Safety is the highest priority for TransCanada. Pipelines are the safest method of all for transporting oil. They are safer by orders of magnitude than tankers, trucks, or rail cars. The Keystone XL pipeline is going to be operated and constructed at a level of safety beyond that of any existing crude oil pipeline in the U.S. Recently, as I think everyone is aware, the U.S. Department of State issued an FEIS for Keystone XL, and it reaffirmed the findings of the two previous environmental impact statements that the pipeline would have very limited environmental consequences. We have been working with our regulator, PHMSA, and we have agreed to incorporate 57 project-specific conditions that will result, according to the Department of State, in a pipeline that has a degree of safety greater than any typically constructed domestic oil pipeline under current regulation. There are strong reasons why we agree with the Department of State that the Keystone XL pipeline will be the safest crude oil pipeline ever built in the U.S. Some of the safety elements include the pipeline's state-of-the-art satellite-linked computerized leak detection and control system. We have agreed to add an increased number of isolation valves along the pipeline, higher than code. We've agreed to add redundant power supply at our pump stations and all of our isolation valves in order to ensure uninterrupted control and safe operation. The pipe's going to be made from high-strength steel that is resistant to puncture, and it's going to be coated inside and out with a very corrosion-resistant shell. At every major river crossing where it is possible, we are going to use directional drilling techniques to drill far back from the edges of the rivers and put the pipe in the bedrock between 25 and 50 feet under the bottom of these major rivers that we're crossing. It's going to be buried deeper than code, and it's going to be inspected more frequently than code, largely to protect it from third-party damage. So just like, as I said, if you listen to our opponents, you would think that oil pipelines leak constantly. They destroy aquifers. With all respect, nothing could be further from the truth. This is Department of Transport figures, and if you take a look at this, these represent number of spills on the left hand per 1,000 miles over a 3-year period. And you can see that in the latest year that these figures are available, in 2008, you would expect a 1,000-mile crude oil pipeline to have 0.7 leaks every 3 years, and on average it would leak 330 barrels. And with respect, I would say that bears no resemblance to the kind of data that we've been hearing from the opponents of Keystone. So just in closing, obviously the oil sands are a major North American energy resource, and the development of this resource provides huge benefits for both Canada and the U.S. As you heard from the other speakers, Canada is already the largest supplier of foreign crude into the U.S., and we expect that relationship will continue to grow in the coming decades. Keystone XL is an obviously critical piece of infrastructure in our relationship, one that is going to benefit U.S. energy security for decades. If Keystone XL were not to be constructed, heavy crude oils from other foreign producers would clearly substitute for the majority of the lost Canadian oil sands supply, and the U.S. would continue to import oil from less friendly nations. And as I said at the start, approval of Keystone XL does not lock in or force the American consumer to continue to buy oil sands oil from the U.S. If demand decreases or in subsequent periods the government decides that they don't want this oil, then the cost of Keystone is not going to be borne by the American public, and that pipeline will run empty. Finally, as I said before, pipelines are demonstrably the safest method of transporting oil, and Keystone XL is going to be the safest crude oil pipeline ever built. It has been designed and will be constructed and operated to the highest standards. So that's all my remarks, and I want to thank everybody once again for taking the time to come.
All right, we have a half hour for questions. I'd like to first just start with very quick follow-up to Alex. Could you respond to Lauren's comment that your biggest client, your refinery client, wants this oil to refine it for export, and his comment that this does not add to U.S. energy security if that's just going to be going abroad?
Well, I think there's probably other people on the panel who...
Look, U.S. imports roughly 9 million barrels a day. The data, actually, you need to have a little more rigor in your presentation. We do not export 2.3 million barrels a day. We move oil back and forth across the North American continent. It is true that we export 1 million barrels to Canada because it's more efficient to export oil in the east and bring it down from the west of Canada. So, and second, total exports of products from the U.S. are quite small. Yes, distillate products were as high as 600,000 barrels a day, but refiners make a joint product. They don't just make one thing. They make a mix of products, and prices shift. And so there are times when distillate needs to go to Europe, but gasoline components need to come to the United States. So it's kind of a, if you don't do a kind of comprehensive analysis, you're going to get the wrong idea by Lauren's presentation, in my view. And the real flaw, I think, in the analysis of people who are critical about this project is they are confusing consumption with production. If you want to control the rate of consumption in the United States, that has got absolutely nothing to do with Canadian oil. We import 9 million barrels a day. Okay, so there's no way we're going to at the margin we're going to back out imports. That's what's going to happen.
So basically,
and even on his
your critique is that some parts of what they're refining is going abroad and the other parts are staying here, so it doesn't affect national security.
It just depends. I told you, my view of national security is somewhat, I think the efficiency of the crude oil production and distribution system is hugely beneficial to the United States, and it has a huge security component. But I'm not fixated on exports versus imports. It's not really solves a problem. What you really want to happen in Canada is for them to have an environment to maximize their production in the most cost-effective way, because that will limit this issue of concentration of production from the potential instability from a higher concentration of low-cost reserves in other parts of the world.
Okay.
This is the real
I think
point.
Paul wanted to weigh in.
And also, if you take a look at the chart that he presented, and actually I was teaching to that chart last night, the increase in exports, gross exports, to dovetail on what Lucian mentioned, connects with the recession in the United States and the financial crisis. This is essentially refineries looking for markets. This is part of what's going on here. And if eventually we get out of this, which could take some time, those gross exports will likely decline. But also getting back to another point that he mentioned, that Canada only has 2.3% of the reserves in the world. That's of conventional oil, and if you add in the unconventional, it's quite a bit more than that. And if you add in the unconventional in the United States, we could have an estimated 3 trillion barrels of oil shale oil, and tar sands sitting in North Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, and Utah. So things
Lauren's
are looking
shaking
a
his
bit
head.
different.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You can argue with BP over the 2.3% figure. I mean, it's actually
They're looking at conventional.
They include. If you look at the footnotes in the statistical review where I got the data, it includes tar sands oil, What it is it's proven oil. It's oil that is economically viable under current economic conditions. It's proven reserves.
Well, then I'll argue with BP about that. They
But
don't
Lauren,
exactly
Lauren,
have
what is... Okay, but let's move beyond the statistic.
I think it's easy to illuminate this. In 1980, the Geological Survey testified before Congress. I was actually at that meeting. They said we had 30 billion barrels of recoverable reserves left in the United States. In 2010, they testified that we had 20. But how much did we produce in that period? Nearly 150 billion barrels. The EIA and the Geological Survey just 6 years ago testified that we were running out of natural gas, that we were going to have to engage in a massive program to import LNG. Right? Today, we have $30 billion worth of LNG receiving facilities in the United States operating at 8% capacity. If you're going to do forecasts about reserves, recoverable, you should have a lot of humility, because the historical record is very bad. Okay. The rate of growth of technology, both the art and science of discovering oil and gas suggests that it's really easy to be wrong.
Thank you. And I have a follow-up for Paul, which is, you painted this very bleak and terrifying picture of potential dislocation in all these countries that supply oil. But Lauren mentioned, well, does Canada really protect us from these oil shocks? I mean, okay, so the U.S. will import the oil from Canada, but won't it also be importing it at the same global price as everyone else is paying if there's a shock to oil supply?
Yeah, but they won't have their supplies cut off, much like what the Italians had to face when Libya collapsed. They would have the access to that oil, and that oil will be straight line to us rather than moving around the world in tankers. Of course, oil markets are world markets. And the shock that I was talking about was cutting off access to it and having to react accordingly to that very quickly. The price of oil coming out of Canada would eventually equilibrate with the price of oil coming out of just about anywhere else. That has the same quality, negating out the transportation costs and all of that.
Right. And a quick follow-up to Alex, and then we'll go to the audience. We saw a map, Lou had a map of the glut of oil, crude oil in the Midwest. I read in one of the reports as part of the review that there's actually excessive capacity for some years of pipeline capacity coming out of Canada into the Midwest. The bottleneck is from the Midwest to the Gulf Coast. Mm-hmm. So given the concerns that some people have about the pipeline going through Nebraska and the aquifer there, why not just do a domestic pipeline from the Midwest to the Gulf Coast?
Well, I think one of the benefits of Keystone is that it does both. It is proposed to connect the greater U.S. Refinery market to Canadian crude. It is also, we have already filed for and planned to pick up to 150 to 200,000 barrels a day of oil at Cushing and take it to the Gulf Coast. And there are numerous other projects already being developed and permitted to do the exact same thing, to get rid of that glut in Cushing.
Okay. David, are we going to be doing microphones, or we're just taking... Okay. If it's a little bit crowded, will people be able to get there? They're back there.
Why don't you call them in?
All right. Well, I'll just start out. I see Daniel Droich here from Pembina has a question, and we'll work around the room. I'm sorry, NRDC now, Danielle. Sorry.
All right. Is it on? Okay. It's hard. I'm going to not have enough time. There's a lot to respond to here. I did want to point out that this morning we put out basically a short piece on why Keystone XL does not provide the U.S. with energy security, and I have copies of that with me. So I encourage those who are interested in another perspective that would be helpful to you. I guess that there's just so much to respond to, so I'm going to point out two pieces here on the national interest question, and I'm going to let my colleague Anthony Swift, who's going to be talking about some of the pipeline safety issues, and we'll be able to respond to some of TransCanada's claims, so I won't actually address those here. One thing that has been thrown around quite frequently are the jobs numbers. And I think it's really important that we actually clarify what, in fact, the job numbers actually are. TransCanada has been relying on a report that the Cornell University has actually come out and said that report is flawed, has methodological errors and flaws. And so, in fact, if a U.S. decision maker is actually to be relying on information, then they should be looking at the State Department's final environmental impact statement, which is actually 5,000 to 6,000 jobs, which are temporary and will not be local. And so, to the extent that job numbers are being thrown around, it's important.
I think we'll let the economics panel get into the nitty-gritty also, but do you have a question on the security side?
Well, on the security, I think some of the general, there's a lot of generalities, but I'm not hearing enough about the extent to which Keystone XL actually was specifically address the vulnerability and the energy security issues. I did not hear, I heard very, very general statements from the other panel members, so I'd like to hear more specifically, how does Keystone XL actually address the U.S. energy security, make the U.S. less vulnerable, and actually reduce exports? Because I actually don't think that you can actually make that assessment.
Who'd like to
and
take
I'd like
that?
one person, then I'd also like for Lauren to be able to respond to that other person.
Well, let me just first, you have to have a data-driven model. Okay, we import 9 million barrels a day. If we get more oil from Canada, we will import less. Lauren showed we're relatively flat demand. I mean, now, what is the value of that is a separate question. But if you, the DOE puts out a study, the EPA used it to justify ethanol, that the value of reducing sort of, imports from the Middle East, far abroad, is like $14 a barrel. We've done it to do some other work on it. So I just don't think we can get away from that. Actually, we have a different take on this. Our view is you want a set of expectations so that the Canadians maximize oil production. And the reason you want that is more having to do with economics even than security. It's high value-added activity. You know what? On the jobs issue, I could put everyone to work tomorrow. I could have half the country dig holes and the other half fill it up. And that will put a lot of people to work. That's really not the issue. The real issue is how do you get sustainable wealth-creating growth? And how you do that is you get permits for high-valued products, for high-valued activity. So if the value of Canadian oil and the value of Keystone Pipeline is above its cost of production, it's going to generate a lot of revenue, a lot of jobs, a lot of return on capital. And by the way, that goes true for the Bakken, for Deepwater Gulf, for Alaska. And so if you want to wrench the economy and you want to transition to the fuels of the future at a very high cost, you're going to impose a large cost on the American economy. Maybe it's worth it for some people, but you can't live in Disneyland, and that's where you are. You have to have high-valued projects permitted in order to get economic growth. And by the way, we are not going to drive our economic growth down unless we start moving at 5 to 6% per year. We are not going to do it at 2%.
All right, Lauren, are you in Disneyland?
Yeah, I think with respect, you just talked about economic issues, not energy security issues. I think
they're very well tied.
Well, they are and they aren't. I mean, we're talking about the vulnerability of the U.S. economy to oil supply shocks and oil price shocks. Now, if you're producing 100% domestic oil in this country, or 50% domestic, 50% Canada, whatever pie in the sky figure you might imagine getting to one day. I mean, let's face it, we're not going to become completely reliant on North American oil. And let's say, the King of Saudi Arabia is assassinated tomorrow morning. What's the first thing you're going to worry about? The price of oil, okay? It doesn't matter how much oil you're producing here. When there's a supply shock, the price goes through the roof. The gas price at the pump goes through. American families are affected by the amount of their budget they're spending on gasoline. We've got to use less. It's the only energy security
But Lauren, why
strategy
can't we use less and also build the pipeline? Are these two things somehow mutually exclusive?
Well, I think when you look at the IEA figures that I showed in my presentation, we can probably bring online a little bit more tar sands oil. But we've got an industry that's going for 6-7 million barrels a day. That takes us complete overshoot on the climate, according to the IEA. This is not me, this is not an NGO, this is not NRDC, this is the International Energy Agency. If we constrain demand commensurate with preventing a climate catastrophe, Canadian tar sands production will be a lot less than it would otherwise be. So, we need an energy policy in this country that looks at all the things that threaten us not just this idea, about energy security, which Canadian oil doesn't address. We need a policy that actually addresses the issues, and that includes a much more aggressive demand reduction than we're actually seeing. Obama's been doing the right thing and trying to push that agenda forward. He's met huge resistance in Congress, and I would say Congress is not acting in the interest of the country by doing that.
All right, we have a question down there at the gentleman in the purple tie.
Thank you, Louisa. I'm Lawrence McDonald from the Center for Global Development. New work at my center looking at the climate impact of exploitation of the tar sands suggests that it's about 20% of the total global budget if we're to hold the parts per million at 450 by the end of the century, which is considered the maximum safe limit. And in fact, many climate scientists seriously doubt that that's safe at all. But the thing that I'd like to raise actually is the balance of the panel and the framing of the issue. I think that it's really a source of embarrassment for the Wilson Center. You have been scrupulously fair, and I appreciate that, but for the Wilson Center, I think there's a serious reputational risk in having a panel that explicitly does not include the climate issues, does not raise the question of whether these oil sands will be exploited regardless of whether the pipeline is built or not. There are a whole set of questions that have not been raised in the write-up, and there has not been an opportunity to raise these questions because the lineup of your panelists is 7 in favor and 2 against. And I encourage those who are interested in this to look at the funding of the Kennedy Institute to the Woodrow Wilson Center. You'll see that Canadian oil companies are very heavily represented. However, the Wilson Center also gets a third of its money from American taxpayers. You're committed to having a fair and balanced approach, and I think that today's panel is very unbalanced. My question is for Lorne, who I think is not receiving his fair share of the time here, and that is one of the questions that has not been framed here. If this pipeline is blocked in the United States, will in fact the tar sands be developed anyway? My understanding is that there's great deal of uncertainty that even proponents of the tar sands development say will be landlocked in bitumen if we don't get the pipeline. And so blocking the pipeline can block the development of this very large source of emissions. Thank you very much.
Before you speak, Lauren, I just want to clarify that our panel is specifically on energy security. I take your point that we're not getting into the nitty-gritty
I thought that the pipeline was on national security.
Issues, but that's because we're trying to address what the State Department
I thought that
is
the
looking
pipeline
at.
was on the framing of the question around national security, and if you're going to look at national security, then you have to look at climate, which the Pentagon says is a major national security threat. If you're not going to look at those issues, then I wonder when you're going to look at them today, because you can't have an event on the pipeline and not consider those issues unless you're in the pay
let's have Lauren
of the Canadian oil
question,
companies.
And then I'd like to have Lou speak to this issue. You've worked in government on these issues. To what extent do you consider, or does the government consider, climate change to be a national security issue? I mean, I know there's a group in the Pentagon that works on this. Their National Security Council, I believe, looks at this. There can be all kinds of impacts, dislocation, drought, ethnic conflicts over resources that come out of climate change. But first, let's go to Lauren.
Sure. Yeah. No, the industry has certainly said a number of times, well, if you don't build this pipeline, you don't take this oil, well, we'll sell it to China. It's simply not as simple as that. They need to build a pipeline to the west coast across British Columbia. If you think Keystone XL was hard to get through, that pipeline is going to be seriously hard to get through. There are First Nation groups in British Columbia who have some of the strongest land rights in North America. They're opposed to the pipeline. They don't want tankers going up and down their coasts. That pipeline, even if it were pushed through, I've heard industry analysts saying it would be unlikely to deliver oil till 2020. So I think it can't be presumed that because this pipeline gets stopped, then tar sands oil will just continue unabated. The industry is absolutely dependent right now for its growth on getting this pipeline through. The Midwest will be full to capacity in terms of being able to refine the heavy oil in a few years' time, and XL is absolutely crucial to the industry. And that's why if we stop it, we will probably impact tar sands production, reduce the amount of growth in the industry, and get the environmental and climate benefits that brings with it.
Okay, Paul also wants to weigh in, but we'll go to Lou first.
Well, first, that's the most compelling case I've heard for the energy security argument. We actually do need the pipeline, apparently, because that's how we're going to get, we're going to shift the long-run supply of North American crude oil, and get on a price path that does two things: makes the American economy more efficient, and second, reduces the relative contribution to the world market of the OPEC producers. So I just don't quite understand why that would be an argument against doing it. In terms of how the Pentagon views climate, yeah, there's lots of people in the Pentagon doing different studies, and some groups have looked at it. I can tell you that Net Assessment does not have the same view. Andy Marshall's group has a completely different perspective on climate and how the Pentagon ought to adjust to it over time. So I don't think that is a done deal in terms of national security. I think the question of climate is an interesting security problem. I just don't see how it gets fixed by denying this project. Canada is a signatory to the Kyoto Protocol. Canada is a transparent, open society with, very attentive to environmental issues, the progress they're making in the way they're producing the oil sands. Look, industrial development is sometimes messy, but I can tell you, the consequences of not developing that are very severe. Look at the public health effects of high unemployment. Look at the public health effects of slow growth in the American economy. Those are severe also. It's a tough call. By the way, they're going to improve this pipeline. I think everyone knows that. This is a done deal. It's going to happen. So what we ought to do is talk about how we integrate it within sort of national energy and national security policy.
All right. We have a question over here.
My name is Joe Dukert. I'm an independent energy analyst specializing in policy for many years, over 30 years. I am not a lobbyist. I'm not in the pay of any pipeline company or oil company. And I'd like to compliment David Biet on the construction of today's panels. I think it's rather insulting, although I don't know the gentleman from the National Defense University, to just automatically assume because he came out on the other side that he was biased to begin with. In connection with security and price, I'd like to point out that easing access to energy has an effect on price. If it didn't, WTI would be selling at a premium to Brent rather than the other way around by, what is it now, $20 or something like that. I do have a question, but it's really to throw things back to two members of the panel following your lead and your first question. Time is an aspect of energy policy that is almost always neglected. And here we have two panelists who have come out on different sides in the question of time. Referring to my notes, Lou Pugliaresi, I think, said that a gradual shift to alternate fuels would have economic benefits for the United States and would reduce, I think you said, risk of failure. Lauren Stockman leaned heavily on what I consider a very optimistic projection of possibly meeting the goal, which I think is a good goal, of getting down to 450 parts per million. Now, it may not produce agreement, but perhaps there's room for convergence on the question of time. So I'd like those two to address each other on the importance of making things move in Congress as well as in the nation and around the world, but also concentrating on getting to a reasonable goal at a reasonable time.
Go ahead, Paul.
I'd like to respond a bit to the bias commentary, and I think part of that might be coming from the fact that I'm from the National Defense University and an assumption of where I'm coming from. Now, if you listen to the last few moments of my speech, I said there are difficult and emotional trade-offs involved with this issue. Yes, the climate trade-offs are going to be there sometime in the future, but we have to look at the short run versus the long run. We have to look at the unemployment that Lou pointed out, and the health effects, and the effects to society, and so forth. And we also need to be reasonable on this. My final comment was this pipeline could help secure our energy needs for the medium term. Please listen carefully. As the U.S. begins the very complex quest to find sustainable and attainable energy security in the future, long run versus short run. With regard to the Pentagon, yes, there are debates going on with regard to the climate change and how that might be a security issue. It's taken quite seriously. The most recent QDR had a section in it for the first time, page 84. If you're interested, go take a look at it. The CO2 production from Canada is what now? 5% of the entire world?
2% of the entire world.
And how much is Alberta?
5%.
Of the 2%, which adds up to 0.1%, if my math is correct. And if you increase the Alberta tar sands, that might go up to what, 1.3% of it? If you want to focus on something, focus on electricity generation and the transport technologies. The largest source of CO2 in the world is electricity production with coal. Second largest, focusing on the internal combustion engine. Change the efficiency of automobiles, lightweight the vehicles. I did mention that in my talk. Focus on technology of transport. That will make a much bigger difference than shutting off a source of energy at a time when there's high unemployment and people are suffering in this country.
Paul, how does the carbon emissions of the oil sands compare to the carbon emissions of coal you just mentioned in the U.S.? And is it any possibility of substituting one for the other?
Well, you can substitute coal for oil by making diesel products through the Fischer-Tropsch process and putting that into cars. But actually, the CO2 production by turning coal into diesel probably would be a bit higher. But the calculations that you want to believe in are going to be the ones that you believe in. There are hundreds of them out there. And with regard to the oil sands to the driven automobile, there is a lot of debate about what exactly is the increase in the percentage of CO2. Some people take the calculation to just the refinery, and of course it's going to be quite a bit larger. But 80% normally of all of the CO2 produced by using oil-based refined products comes from the burning of it inside of the automobile.
Sorry, Louise. I was going to say just the actual facts in terms of CO2 emissions. The oil sands right now, I think the most recent year is 2009, and the oil sands on a daily basis produced 1/30th of the greenhouse gas emissions of the U.S. coal fleet. There are individual coal plants in the U.S. that produce 2/3 of the greenhouse gases of the oil sands.
Lauren, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's getting optimistic, the idea that we might hit 450 ppm. That is an appalling situation that we're facing as a result of a lack of political will in recent years, and we really need to do something about it. It's not about really so much about the CO2 emissions directly in Alberta of the oil sands. It's about the infrastructure that we're locking in for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 decades to supply oil to this country at a time when we should be drastically reducing our
Well, do you
demand.
buy Alex's argument that, well, if we don't need it, it'll just sit there empty?
Well, why build it then? I mean, that's great. I'm glad the taxpayer won't be paying for your empty pipeline, but I think we really need to question whether we need the pipeline in the first place. There are other projects out there that will bring back on crude to market. There are other projects that will link Cushing to the Gulf Coast. Do we need, we have spare capacity in the Alberta Clipper line and the first Keystone pipeline. Do we really need new capacity direct from the tar sands at this time? The thing will be producing oil at the earliest, if we permit it tomorrow, at the end of 2013. Within 6 years, we should be seeing a steeper decline in oil demand in this country as a result of efficiency policies.
Alex,
and
would you like to?
that's the path we should be on. And can I just say, if we, the IEA pointed out, yes, we should focus on coal and electricity generation. Absolutely. The IEA quote I put up there: we cannot address climate mitigation without addressing oil. That's the IEA saying that. We have to face the fact that we need to downsize on oil. In that 450 scenario, oil demand globally peaks in 2018. CO2 emissions have to peak by 2020 to stay within 450 ppm. So, I think, we've gotten into this debate on CO2 about how much more it is on a well-to-wheels basis, and coal is so much worse, and we're actually ignoring the lock-in that we're creating by carrying on business as usual in the face of a genuine crisis that we have.
I think Paul wanted to respond.
With regard to the lock-in, I'd like to get back to Joe Dukert's comment about time and what I understand that to be. If we're going to transition to a new energy future, this cannot be done overnight. This is going to take multiple decades. If anyone's thinking we can switch to something away from hydrocarbons and oil in the next century even, I think that the economic shocks and the political shocks, what would happen in the Middle East if this happened too quickly is another question. Timing is a big issue here. And if we're going to be shifting our technologies, there has to be a time for diffusion to occur. 25 million people out of work. Short-run decision, get the oil here, get the jobs, get the economy moving, increase production in this country. And yes, there is surge capacity. The senator mentioned that out of North Dakota, going from 0 to pretty much 600,000 barrels a day in a quick time. Again, this is a trade-off between time spans.
Mm-hmm. Do we have more questions?
Yeah, I mean, look. Actually, North America is on the verge of being a major value-added processing center in the world. We're going to go back to the 50s or 60s. It's not a bad thing. We have this huge value-added. We can either import it or we can have it produced domestically. But so once again, I think it's really lacks a lot of rigor if you're confusing consumption with production. High-valued production is extremely valuable to Canada and the United States. That is completely different when you're importing these massive amounts of oil from the question of consumption. You want to constrain consumption. You want to impose a cost on the economy. There are plenty of ways to do that, and there's a big debate. Think of it this way. If you really think that the value of transitioning to the fuels of the future is so important and so necessary for climate and for just the functioning of how we operate our economy, put a $4, $5 tax on gasoline. Put very heavy taxes on fossil fuels. But you will impose a very large cost in terms of economic growth and the structure of the economy because the existing capital structure is designed to burn fossil fuels. And as Paul pointed out, transitioning away from that economy is a long and hard road. But picking on an individual project which has this high value is a really kind of counterproductive strategy.
Okay. I'm sorry. I wanted to get a question there. We're starting to run out of time here, so go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Jane Moffett, and I'm with the Canadian American Business Council. I have a question for Mr. Pourbet. So I live in Washington now, but I'm from a remote sort of northern Ontario community. I grew up in a small town in northern Ontario called North Bay, and many hundreds of, I would guess, thousands of miles of pipeline go through communities much like mine, and I would guess that many of the communities in the U.S. that are sort of part of this pipeline proposal are much like the community where I grew up. And I'm just hoping that Mr. Pourbet can address sort of the history, that this is certainly not the first pipeline that TransCanada has built, and that the sort of safety issues and the mention of the pipeline safety across Canada and the history of that with TransCanada.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. We're the largest pipeline company in North America. We have somewhere in excess of 35,000 miles of overwhelmingly large-inch diameter pipeline, and we believe that we are one of the safest pipeline operators in North America. But I think that this just goes to the issue that as opposed to what you may hear from our opponents, pipelines are not inherently unsafe. You saw the data I put up. Pipelines are inherently safe. I mean, I'll give you...
Alex, we've had a lot of spills lately. Can you address that? I mean, there's been a lot of coverage in the past year.
Mm-hmm. Well, and, like any other industrial undertaking, I mean, you are going to see accidents, but it doesn't take away from the fact that the pipelines are incredibly safe. And one of the other points that I would make is that the average crude oil pipeline in this country is 40 years old. The pipeline that we're going to build today bears almost no resemblance to those pipelines that were built 40 years ago. We have state-of-the-art fusion bond epoxy coating. We have automated welding. We have smart pigs that go through that pipeline on a regular basis to check for any corrosion, for dents. 2/3 of all pipeline releases are actually caused by third-party line strikes. Actually, farmers or other people not checking the one-call number, hitting the pipeline with a backhoe, and that's just the facts. This is an extraordinarily safe. That doesn't, as I said, the incidents that we've seen just lead the industry to do everything they can to make it more safe. You saw this terrible incident that Exxon had on the Yellowstone River. That was a tough incident, and it was a tough outcome for Montana. I mean, new pipelines like TransCanada's pipeline, you heard me say before, every major river crossing we do, where it is possible, we're going to directionally drill. We're not going to be within 25 feet of the bottom of the river, and you're never going to see a scouring incident, the likes of which you saw. So the industry continues to improve its track record and make it safer and safer.
All right. As the gentleman mentioned, we're trying to focus on national security. So one last question from the audience, please, on national security. And I want to take one from the side of the room. The gentleman who has his hand up.
Hi, my name's Joey Furman. I'm not representing anybody. I'm just here as a person and who wants to live on this planet, as all of us do. I'm really grateful for everyone being here today, and I'm just going to return to questions about climate security, just because that's really important to me. I actually trust that you can develop the technology that's not going to leak. That's really a side issue to me. Mm-hmm. I'm concerned about the concerns about climate destruction and catastrophe, and the fact that 18 climate scientists, including James Hansen, has said this is essentially game over for the climate. And I'd like to propose that if we all lived in a village that we'd invested in over several generations, and we can imagine this village to be the oil industry, and a lot of people had worked really hard to make it really safe and really productive, and many beautiful lives had been lived because of the hard work of that industry, including mine and including all of ours. But people who we trust as our scientists, who are leading the science in this country and around the world, were telling us that that village we were living in was threatening all life. Wouldn't it make sense to stop developing that village and to get out of there and to find the best thing as soon as possible? I understand that all of you have invested a lot of time and a lot of education in and I really appreciate this illuminating. I got arrested outside the White House. I was one of the 1,252, and that's my personal odyssey as a young person trying to figure out what's going on in the world. But I appreciate, and I'm here really respecting what you have to say, and I'm really grateful. And I hope that all of your intelligence can be shifted away from fossil fuels as soon as possible and mobilized towards alternative energy, because I don't see how, unless you really let go of the fact that as hard as you try, it really seems to me that you're working in an industry that's going to destroy the planet if we don't get away from fossil fuels. And I understand that fossil fuels will have to be part of that transition, but I have to agree with Mr. Stockman and others who have said that if we build more houses in this village, it's going to be hard for people to move out. If we lock ourselves in and we build up all these jobs and all these representatives and all these different things, I don't understand how it's going to help us transition. And just as a person who's concerned about the life of my 2-year-old niece, and yes, these are emotional issues.
Paul, do you think we can do this transition?
Just a question. So the question is, especially for the representative from TransCanada, how can you how do you see this project relating to climate security, and how do you think TransCanada can play a role in actually transitioning to a future that's not going to destroy life?
So I'm happy to answer that, and although I'm not a representative of the Canadian government, maybe I can talk a little bit about what the Canadian government is doing. And the fact of the matter is that the oil sands are going to be the economic engine of growth for Canada for the next probably 50 or 100 years. The Canadian government has realized that, but also realizes that it wants to do something on the greenhouse gas side. So right off the bat, that Canada has committed to the same reductions in greenhouse gas that the United States did in Copenhagen. And there are many ways to get there. we are going to develop the oil sands because it is so important to this country, but the Canadian government has committed to many other things to do to reduce greenhouse gas in other industries. Beyond the oil industry, beyond transportation, one of the large emitters of greenhouse gas in Canada is a coal fleet, our coal-fired power plant. Unlike the U.S., Canada has committed to shut down that fleet as those units reach the end of their life. So the Canadian government is in the process of implementing legislation that will see every coal plant shut down by law or move to a combined cycle gas emission standard at the end of 45 years. Coal plants can't do that. They're going to be shutting down. That's how we're going to meet our Copenhagen commitment. So although this pipeline is going to be developed and this resource is going to be developed, it doesn't mean that Canada is not taking climate change seriously and is not implementing policy to do their part globally. And as I said, we've committed to do everything that this administration in Washington is committed to do for the U.S.
Thank you, Alex. And I just want to give Lauren the last word here since you're the minority voice, so in the interest of balance.
Somebody mentioned earlier Canada's a signatory to the Kyoto Protocol, but it actually missed its targets by a huge percentage. I forget the figure off the top of my head, but it did not reach its targets, primarily because of the tar sands growth that's occurring. I think it's great if Canada shuts its coal plants. I'd like to see it happen. But the evidence to date has been Canada's emissions have been growing and growing and growing. If they start to address that now in the coming years, that'll be great, but we haven't actually seen the action happen yet, and it needs to do something really rather quickly.
All right. Well, thank you very much to all our panelists and to all the questioners. I think this was a really good starting point for thinking about the national security issues. It'll be interesting to see what the State Department comes out at the end of this process.